This is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. This is the third edition of our teaching regarding the prophetic significance to the Day of Atonement. We believe there are so many potential parallels pointing to when Yeshua could come. We need to always stay open as we continually search the Scriptures. For those who are quick to say, "No man knows the day or hour, Steve," please see our written teaching titled Knowing the Day. I believe you'll find it of interest. Now, today's presentation is an expansion of many new elements that point to the Day of Atonement. Not long after I made the first edition of this teaching, I made the teaching Afflict Yourself. While this updated teaching will present a few elements from that teaching to tie some points together, I pray you consider watching it, as there is still many parts of it that won't be covered here. However, that presentation really does add a lot to this teaching. I believe this teaching, combined with that one, could be two of the most important teachings I've ever made. This presentation is basically an extension from our teaching, the 1-year tribulation and the return of Yeshua. So, if you haven't seen that teaching, you're going to want to. There'll be several references in this presentation that will make more sense when you see that teaching. Now, you can watch this teaching without seeing that one first. However, it will be more easily understood once you watch that one. This teaching will be presenting the same perspective of the tribulation lasting 1 year, but with a few different angles for us to consider. Regardless of what year things play out, we need to have all the options on the table for us to consider. So, with that in mind, I pray you watch these teachings with an open heart. In the 1-year tribulation teaching, I presented a thought in how the resurrection could take place 30 days before a holy day, namely 30 days before Trumpets, Sukkot, or the last day of Sukkot. That 30 days being the added 30 days of the 1,290 from the 1,260 days. However, what if those added 30 days are included with the days that are cut short? In looking at this, we need to discuss some basics as we lead into covering those days noted by Daniel. We won't be going into the details of those basics, but just the foundation to them. We'll give the teachings that explain the details if you wish to study them further. Let me start off with clarification that we believe the resurrection takes place before the tribulation. Remember, Yeshua said to pray you escape all these things and stand before the Son of Man. You see, it's not just a prayer of escape. It's a prayer to be found worthy to stand before Yeshua at the marriage covenant. This is important to understand. It's a prayer to be found worthy to stand before Yeshua at the marriage covenant. And that's what we see in Revelation. We see this group of people taken out, and they see the destruction of Babylon. It then says they are taken for the marriage. So they escape and are taken to the marriage just as Yeshua said to pray for. When the bride is taken for the wedding, the time of purification for those who weren't ready begins. But the bride doesn't just escape the tribulation and go to the wedding. She also escapes the birth pains when she goes to the wedding. The tribulation is the time when the Antichrist rules for 42 months, as seen here in Revelation. This is believed to be equal to the 1,260 days noted elsewhere. But Daniel also mentions the 1,290 days and added 30 days. A time we've shown is cut short to 1/3 the time, that being 430 days, exactly 1/3 of the 1,290 days. We cover that in our teaching 1/3 and our teaching the coming alien invasion and Bible prophecy. The resurrection is the event that begins the birth pains. Remember, Isaiah said the resurrection takes place before the birth pains begin. Before. We cover this in detail in our teaching simply titled The Birth Pains. So again, it's the birth pains and the tribulation that the bride is taken from for the wedding. The 1,260 days of the Antichrist, plus an added 30 days of the birth pains, totaling the 1,290 days. The time Yeshua said would be cut short. Most likely cut short to the prophesied 430 days as found in Ezekiel 4. The resurrection Isaiah speaks of takes place at a massive earthquake. Thus, the earth giving birth to her dead is what causes the earthquake. The dead coming out of the ground is the source of the earthquake at the 6th seal. Showing what? The first 5 seals take place before the resurrection. We don't believe the bride is mysteriously taken away at any given moment like many hold to. In fact, Yeshua shows this isn't the case. He implies there's a wake-up event to alert the bride of his coming in the parable of the 10 virgins. They're told to come out to meet him, implying there's something for his bride to do. Remember, Noah was given a 7-day warning before being protected. Lot was given a 1-day warning before being protected. Could the parable of the 10 virgins be symbolic of a 10-day warning for his bride just the same? Plus, we know the church of Smyrna is to suffer specifically for 10 days, as seen here. This could be the 10 days between trumpets to the Day of Atonement, with the resurrection taking place on the Day of Atonement. But who is the bride? The messages to the 7 churches lets us know it's not all who claim his name. At the time of the first covenant, those who Yahweh took for his bride was also given the title of his son, as seen here. And what do we see at the resurrection? Those who are resurrected are noted as his son. This is seen in Isaiah 66 and also in Revelation 12. Just as he took his firstborn son for the covenant at Mount Sinai, we see he takes his firstborn from the dead for the new covenant. This is also seen in Romans chapter 8. And we see after the resurrection, noted here in Revelation 12, the days of the Antichrist's rule begins not long afterwards. Thus, the resurrection precedes the birth pains that usher in the rule of the Antichrist. However, as noted, the resurrection takes place at the 6th seal. Thus, the first 5 seals take place before the resurrection. These first 5 seals could begin taking place sometime between trumpets to the Day of Atonement, with the resurrection taking place on the Day of Atonement. This leads us into how the tribulation could be cut short. Yeshua said that which was given to Daniel would be cut short. This is noted in Matthew 24:15 through 22. He said, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken through the prophet Daniel." Well, what did Daniel specifically say about the abomination that causes desolation? Daniel 12:11. From the time the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Well, there it is. Yeshua is speaking directly about the 1,290 days. He wasn't just talking about the 42 months or the 1,260 days. He said these days would be cut short, as seen in verse 22. So, while the normal thought has been he would shorten only the 1,260 days, the days of the Antichrist, we see Yeshua was directly referencing the 1,290 days. But how does the Day of Atonement connect with all of it being shortened? First, let's look at the similarities between the instructions for the Day of Atonement, as we see here in Leviticus 16, compared to what we see happens here in Revelation at the time of the first 5 trumpets. Both references are discussing censers filled with burning coals from the altar, seen here in Leviticus, and then seen here in Revelation. Both references are discussing the smoke of the incense, seen here in Leviticus, and then seen here in Revelation. Both references are discussing they are before the throne, seen here in Leviticus, and then seen here in Revelation. Both references are discussing how blood is thrown upon something, seen here in Leviticus, and then seen here in Revelation. And both references are discussing how it's done 7 times, seen here in Leviticus, and then seen here in Revelation. Surely, this is not just a coincidence. So, could the Day of Atonement be more important to the end times than what many may have thought? The verses in Revelation are discussing the trumpet judgments. These officially start with the opening of the 7th seal. I discussed the first 5 trumpets in detail in our teaching simply titled The First 5 Trumpets. If you haven't seen that teaching, I believe you may find it of interest. While it may seem odd to consider the Day of Atonement for the day of the resurrection, please consider some thoughts here. The Day of Atonement is the day when the bride would be truly made spotless. This is the day when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies for all the people. Yeshua is our high priest now in the heavenly temple, so he would be doing this for us in heaven. Thus, his bride is made ready for the wedding. It can fulfill the day of mourning, just like Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 3 says. Please consider this text and remember, the highlighted text is what Yeshua already quoted in Luke 4. This means we are waiting for him to fulfill the rest of this text. Now, as I read this text, please remember that the Day of Atonement is the day we are to afflict ourselves, as noted here in Leviticus. Now, let's read Isaiah 61. The Spirit of Sovereign Yahweh is on me, because Yahweh has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of Yahweh for the display of his splendor. So, the Day of Atonement can definitely fit the day of mourning that is turned into gladness. Plus, it's before Sukkot. That means it's the ending of the grape harvest. So, the verses in Revelation 14 regarding the grape harvest can still apply. Not only this, but the Day of Atonement is the last day of the 40 days of repentance and mourning. Why is this of significance? Well, please consider these verses regarding the last day. John 6:39, but raise them up at the last day. John 6:40, I will raise him up at the last day. John 6:44, I will raise him up at the last day. And John 6:54, I will raise him up at the last day. I know this 40-day count is more of a Jewish tradition, and I have no proof that it was even around when Yeshua made these statements. However, I still find it interesting nonetheless. At the same time, the last day being referenced in these verses could simply be discussing the last opportunity to be found in Yeshua, the last day of repentance through the one sin sacrifice that's made for all the people on that day, the Day of Atonement. That being said, please consider how the 10th day of the first month is the day of choosing a spotless lamb for Passover. It's the day of selection. So, could the 10th day of the 7th month be the day when the lamb chooses his bride? A day of selection for those who are spotless in him? An element that bears a lot of weight to this is Deuteronomy 24:5. You've heard me mention this verse many times regarding a man to have 1 year with no war so he can be with his bride. However, there's another element to that verse we can't forget. Not only is he to not go to war, but he is to not have any other obligation put on him for 1 full year. Well, Yeshua is our high priest in heaven. What's the primary responsibility of the high priest? He's to go into the Holy of Holies once a year. Once a year. So, if Yeshua fulfills that obligation in the heavenly temple on the Day of Atonement, his bride is then spotless. He can then immediately take his bride for the wedding. He then has a full year after taking his bride to be with her until he has to fulfill his duty as high priest again. Again, 1 full year. In light of his responsibility as high priest in the heavenly temple, it's hard to imagine any other possible time for him to take his bride and be able to have a full year with no commitment elsewhere. Plus, the Torah gives no time allocated for when the high priest is to go into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement. This explains why we won't know the hour as described in our written teaching, Knowing the Day. Again, the Day of Atonement was when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for himself first and then for the people. During that whole time, the people were praying and watching for the high priest to come out. They wanted to know if the sacrifice had been accepted. They did this in hopes that judgment wouldn't come. Think about that. They were watching for him to come out and praying the whole time. Does that sound familiar? Watching and praying? It should. Luke 21:36. Be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. Yeshua is our high priest in the heavenly temple. how fitting it is for us to humble ourselves on this day, the same way as prescribed in the Torah, and watch and pray for His return. But there are other elements that could point to this day as well. On the Day of Atonement, we see 2 goats. One is sacrificed for the sins of the people. One is let go. However, it says the sins of the people are on the one that's let go. It says it's let go into the wilderness. What I'm personally struggling with is understanding why the sins of the people are placed on the one that's set free if those sins were paid for by the one that was sacrificed. I'll continue working on that. But nonetheless, we see how one is set free specifically into the wilderness. So, 2 goats. One is sacrificed, and the other is literally sent to the wilderness. This is seen at the time of Yeshua's crucifixion. We see Yeshua and Barabbas. Yeshua is taken to be killed, and Barabbas is set free. Very reminiscent of the Day of Atonement at Passover. What's also interesting is the name Barabbas. The name Barabbas means son of the Father. The first part of his name, Bar, means son in Aramaic. Yeshua used this term when addressing Simon as Peter, calling him Simon Bar Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah. In the second half of his name, we see Abba, which means father. So, Barabbas, son of the Father. Barabbas is the criminal who, according to Luke's Gospel, was put in jail for insurrection and murder. So, we have the son who is innocent but killed, and then we have the son who is guilty of rebellion and murder, but is set free. What do we see at the Day of Atonement? We see 1 goat killed for the sins of the people. We then see another goat with the sins of the people sent into the wilderness. But again, please notice the meaning of Barabbas' name and how he parallels the goat sent to the wilderness on the Day of Atonement. The Son of the Father sent to the wilderness. Where else do we see this? Yahweh takes Israel, his son, out of Egypt and sends them to the wilderness for the marriage covenant. He sent his son to the wilderness for the marriage covenant, coming out of Egypt, going into the wilderness for the marriage covenant. On the same note, there's a good possibility that Yahweh first appeared to Moses in the burning bush on the Day of Trumpets, and then Moses appeared before Pharaoh on the Day of Atonement. They were to take a journey out into the wilderness to celebrate a feast, which would have been the Feast of Sukkot. So, announcement, intervention, selection, and then marriage. We know Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart, and they weren't let go until the time of Passover. However, if this theory is correct, then that means the original time for the marriage covenant was at Sukkot instead of Shavuot. Though some may struggle with this, we can't forget how the firstborn son is to be the one to whom the inheritance belongs. However, how many times have we seen the blessing given to the second-born? So, just as Yahweh chose the second-born to bring forth the promise, the fall feasts are the second set of holy days in the year. So the second set of holy days could be the chosen season to bring in the eternal promise. Thus, the new covenant most likely will take place at Sukkot, the original time for the covenant to take place. In fact, the 10 plagues that fell on Egypt could be representative of the 10 days between trumpets to the Day of Atonement. Likewise, in the future, it's possible the declaration of, "Let my people go," is given on trumpets. Then some will escape. The enemy refuses and begins the 10 days of persecution on the church of Smyrna. Then, on the 10th day, like the 10th plague, the judgment falls. Plus, we can't forget how Sukkot is noted as the first place they went to when they left Egypt. This could be showing us a shadow of what's to come the next time around, it being at the time of Sukkot. So, if, and I say if, this is something for us to consider, how could it all play out? While there are obviously many options, here's one to consider. The wake-up event would most likely take place on the Day of Trumpets, which really should be called the Day of Shouting, because it's Yom Teruah, Day of Shouting. It's not Yom Shofar, Day of Trumpets. And remember, the 10 virgins are woke up by a shout. Something to take note of. Then the bride goes out to meet the bridegroom as they are told, thus protected from the first 5 seals in the wilderness, making the distinction between his people and the world as was done at the 4th plague in Egypt with the land of Goshen. However, at the same time, we see the hardness of heart from the enemy in persecuting those who didn't get out fast enough. Thus, the persecution on the church of Smyrna for 10 days. Then, the resurrection on the Day of Atonement. And then the wedding at Sukkot. With the wedding being at the time of Sukkot, the time of dwelling in tents, it's very reminiscent of what we see in Revelation as noted earlier. The wedding is mentioned right after the resurrection seen here in Revelation 19. Likewise, right after the resurrection in the 6th seal, we see the 144,000 and the church of Philadelphia. Revelation 7 shows the 144,000 and the large group of people. It says he will put his tent over them. This could be an obvious pointer to the time of Sukkot, placing his tent over them. The interesting thing with this theory is how there are almost always 430 days from within the 10 days between trumpets and atonement to the 24th day of the 9th month. Now, why is that significant? As already noted, the 430 days are the 1,290 days of Daniel cut short by 1/3. Just like the end of the 430 years from the time Yahweh made the covenant with Abraham, he set Israel free from their daily bondage in Egypt. Likewise, after Armageddon, we see Isaiah 66 mention how Yahweh will send messengers out to bring his people back from all over the world. So the 24th day of the 9th month could be the day the last of those people are freed, and they begin their journey to the land in the 2nd Exodus. We cover that in our teaching simply titled, The 2nd Exodus. But why is the 24th day of the 9th month of any significance? Because it's noted that from this day on, he would bless his people. Thus, their time of daily punishment, as prophesied through Ezekiel 4, is over, and they can return to his ways. The 430 days, as given to Ezekiel, would be fulfilled on the people. So, it's possible the ark comes out sometime during these 10 days to start the 430-day count. the abomination of desolation being given, as Daniel says. This is covered in our teaching, the 1-year tribulation and the return of Yeshua. In closing, I want to give you something that was recently shared with me. It shows Yeshua taking his bride out to the wilderness in the life of David. It's in the story of Nabal and Abigail where we see this imagery. David is in the wilderness. He's anointed king by Samuel, while Saul, the unrighteous king, is reigning in the city, showing Yeshua anointed king in the wilderness and the Antichrist over the New World Order. This is described in our teaching, Satan's Greatest Masquerade, Part 1 and Part 2. I strongly encourage you to consider watching these teachings. Now, regarding the story of Nabal and Abigail, I'll give the verses on screen for context and highlight the parts being referenced. David sends 10 men to the wicked man Nabal, representing the 10 Commandments. David blessed Nabal and now wanted something in return from Nabal, just like Yeshua expects fruit from believers. But Nabal refused. Abigail, his wife, however, gives a different response. She does produce fruit for the king and repentance to go with it. Abigail describes her husband as a foolish man, representing the 5 foolish from the parable of the virgins. Abigail doesn't tell her husband of the things that happened right away because he is too drunk. Drunkards don't inherit the kingdom. However, she did tell him in the morning when he was sober. But his heart failed him, and Yahweh struck him down 10 days later, representing the 10-day period from trumpets to atonement. The trumpet is sounded to warn the people of the coming king and to repent. Nabal was warned. He refused the warning and paid for it 10 days later. After Nabal is dead, Abigail is extended an offer of marriage, representing the marriage of the Lamb, to marry the king in the wilderness, representing the 5 wise virgins, which is exactly what Abigail did. Please note what Abigail says to David when she goes out to marry him. Here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants. This is what Yeshua showed us we need to be like in order to be his bride, which he showed the disciples. And notice who goes with Abigail to meet her new husband. 5 maidservants. Again, showing who she represents, the 5 wise virgins. It's also important to note how Abigail went quickly. She wasted no time. She was taken to the king by his messengers, representing the angels that go out to collect his bride for him at the resurrection. It's also interesting to note how Abigail's name means my father's joy, all pointing to the new covenant starting in the wilderness. As noted in several other teachings, Hosea chapter 2:14 through verse 23 describes the new covenant taking place in the wilderness. To us, the Day of Atonement makes a lot of sense. So much so, we can't overlook these pointers. If this is the day he takes his bride, then we believe this could also be the day of the great earthquake of Isaiah 24. For more on that, you'll want to see our teachings, Pre-Trib, the Church of Philadelphia, and our teaching, Birth Pains. How will it all play out? Well, that remains to be seen. However, I believe what I presented here in this teaching gives us some strong considerations for the Day of Atonement. There are so many variables that can play out as far as timing and events go. May we always, always have a heart that stays open and researching this topic. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.